If you don't know me, my name is Tal Howard, and I direct the Center for Christian Studies and the Jerusalem and Athens Honors Forum. I thought just a message to you students, if you're interested in the Honors Forum, we have some brochures up there, and we'll be doing applications in the spring semester once you get back from break. So I hope some of you pick up the brochures and take a look at it or check it out online. Today we have a wonderful talk. And after that, the format, there's going to be a talk by our guest, Gideon Strauss, and then a brief commentary by our own economist, Bruce Webb, to kind of begin the discussion, and then open Q&A, which I'll moderate. But at this time, I'm very pleased to recognize my colleague, Tim Sherritt, in the Political Science Department, who's going to do the formal introduction of our speakers. So.
Our speaker, Gideon Strauss, is Senior Fellow with the Center for Public Justice, where he previously served as Chief Executive Officer and editor of their Capital Commentary. Before joining the center, he served as editor of the journal Comment at the think tank Cardus, previously known as the Work Research Foundation, and as the Research and Education Director of the Christian Labor Association of Canada. Now, Dr. Strauss completed his PhD in social philosophy at the then University of the Orange Free State in Bloemfontein, South Africa, with a dissertation on the ethics of public welfare. A native of South Africa, though you'd never tell from his accent, he served as an interpreter for the country's Truth and Reconciliation Commission under Archbishop Desmond Tutu. He was also an advisor to the South African Constitutional Assembly on portions of the 1996 Constitution of the Republic of South Africa. Gideon is married to Angela and is the father of Tala and Hannah, many of whom you know, because both are students at Gordon. If I could sum up my appreciation of Gideon Strauss in just a few words, I would say that he thinks Christianly about politics and society, and he can do it out loud. Now, his talk today is one of two talks under the larger umbrella title of The Welfare State Ideal and the Public Debt Reality. And today's talk is The Coming War Between the Young and the Old. So if today's talk is war, I can promise you that tomorrow's is peace. Because the title tomorrow is We Are All in This Together, young and old, I suppose. Slow Politics and Intergenerational Justice. Now, doesn't that urge you to be there also? That'll be tomorrow in Convocation. So I am delighted, we are delighted to welcome Dr. Strauss to Gordon College again. Thank you.
welfare state. Aha. So I want to say just a few things, convictions that I have coming into this conversation. The first of these convictions is that the American welfare state is a good thing. Throughout the history of the American Republic, there has been a certain sense of common responsibility held by Americans as a political community, also for those of our neighbors and fellow citizens who are more vulnerable and in need for a certain amount of help. But certainly, as of the administration of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, there's been a growth in the modern welfare state in ways that I think must be understood as a positive development. So developments that allowed the American Republic to take care politically for the needs of those of our fellow citizens who are in particular kinds of needs. So that's a presupposition that I bring with me. I don't think that the demise of the American welfare state is a good thing. Among the many things that I am not a libertarian. And so I don't have a vision of the state as being something that should be really, really, really minimal. I think that a welfare state like that of the American Republic is a good thing. So that's a presupposition that I bring to this conversation. Second conviction that I bring into this conversation is that the federal debt and the way in which it is growing and that the prospect of its future growth is a very significant threat to the fabric of this political community and to the operations of its government. So the federal debt is a real problem in my mind. And I think that the way in which the growth of the federal debt affects the functioning of the American welfare state is bringing about a divergence in the interests, between the interests of older Americans and younger Americans, in such a way that the political and economic interests of older and younger people in the American Republic increasingly are at odds with one another. And this, I think, threatens to fray, to pull apart, not just the fabric of this political community, but the social fabric of the United States. For a fun introduction to what that threat looks like, you might want to read a book by the filmmaker and comedian Albert Brooks. As best as I know, no relation to Arthur Brooks, who spoke last night. But in a science fiction novel, 2030, Albert Brooks paints a picture of America in the year 2030 in which he extrapolates contemporary trends, specifically as the growth of the federal debt squeezes out the capacity of the American federal government to address all of its various responsibilities. And in the scenario that Brooks sketches, what this means is that the needs of younger Americans, for example, with regard to education, access to health care, and a number of other needs that are currently addressed by the federal government and by other levels of government, get squeezed out as the needs of older Americans fill up more and more and more of the budget's capacity. Now, he brings in a few additional elements to make that a believable story. In his science fiction scenario, there's a cure for cancer that occurs in the 2010s, and a number of other medical breakthroughs that allow people to live to an older age without necessarily being much healthier. And so there's an ever-growing population of people who need greater interventions funded out of Medicare and Medicaid. And so Brooks paints a picture in which younger people are becoming more and more aggressively disaffected with the political order and angry at what they are calling the olds. So that the slogan of an insurgent movement of the young is kill the olds, take their jobs. Now, just to allay your fears, a war between the young and the old is not the worst possible future for America. Because there's always the prospect of the zombie apocalypse. So I'll speak for a few moments about the zombie apocalypse because it is taken quite seriously by political scientists. Daniel Dresner, who writes for Foreign Policy, published a book based on an article that he wrote for Foreign Policy some time ago on theories of international politics and zombies. I don't know if you teach it at Gordon. But it tries to figure out the implications for international politics of a zombie apocalypse. You know, well, how should the American federal government deal with this particular possibility? And, in this particular instance, this helps us because it at least gives us one thing worse than the coming war between the young and the old to think about. The federal government takes the prospect of the zombie apocalypse quite seriously. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention on their website have resources available for citizens who want to prepare for the possibility of a zombie apocalypse. And so you can go to their website and there's sort of checklists of ways to prepare for the zombie apocalypse. Now, you know, it's not a scenario where the state provides for all of our possible needs in the face of the zombie apocalypse. So if you really do want to be prepared after you've read the instructions from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, you may want to head over to the ACE Hardware website where they have checklists for home preparedness. And there's a range of things that you can purchase for them and that you can store in your basement or perhaps more handily in some less dark spot in your house than the basement. Because you know in the horror movie you don't want to go to the basement. That's always the bad move, to go down to the basement and see what the sound is down there. So there are all kinds of things that we can do to prepare for the zombie apocalypse, all kinds of resources available, great theoretical thinking. But we don't really seem to have adequate thinking to help us think about the national debt and what we should do about what that might do to the American welfare state. I checked, yesterday or the day before on where the public debt is at the moment. People who worry about this, and for what it's worth, you were probably, when you woke up this morning and you thought about the list of things you should worry about, you probably thought about papers that are due. You might have thought about what it's going to be like at Christmas dinner, you know, and the usual sort of family tensions. All kinds of things that you might be worrying about, but you probably didn't wake up and thought, I should worry about the American federal government's debt. There are people who worry about this, and they have websites, and they keep tabs on this, and I want to say to you that you really should worry about this. Among the various challenges that we would be facing as a political community, citizens and government of the United States, I think that the prospect of an ever-growing federal debt is indeed one of the most serious problems. Speaking to Dr. Sargent earlier, he said that he was worrying about the students and other young people working in his office because they're not going to have Social Security, and what will we do to deal with that prospect? And it's a very real prospect that the American federal government will not be able to pay for things. And so let's look at that a little bit more. You may want to start saving towards your $48,000 worth contribution towards that debt. Is this a real problem? The Congressional Budget Office thinks that it is. They have, in their more optimistic scenario, they have a combination of all federal spending other than spending on interest on the debt, specifically taking into account entitlement spending on Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. They figure that expenditures will exceed revenues around 2022. That's not taking into account taking care of the debt as such. And I should mention that this is by far the most optimistic scenario that the office is able to come away with. They have taken into account a number of potential changes to the various factors, and there are far scarier scenarios than this. Klein Perkins is a private firm that looks at the broader sort of political economy of the United States, and they recently published a book called USA Incorporated, in which they analyzed the the finances of America as though it were a corporation. And in their case, one of the slides that they prepared for their presentation suggests that if we only take payments, interest payments on the debt and entitlements, so Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, that will exceed revenue also very close to 2022. So however you want to cut it, somewhere in the 2020s, the federal government will be faced with a situation where it cannot pay for anything other than servicing the debt and current entitlement programs. And so that means all of the other things that government is supposed to do, you simply wouldn't be able to do. It's a scenario that Albert Brooks paints in the 2030 novel, where the president is elected and basically recognizes that he's not going to do anything. He's going to fill an office, he's going to sign checks to pay for the debt and a few other things, but he's not going to be able to really do the kinds of things that government should be doing. Just for what it's worth, federal debt. Now, I should just make a footnote here. There are all kinds of ways to parse the federal debt. Usually, the debt is analyzed into two portions, so federal debt held by the public, and then interagency debts. You can look at debt that is held by people who are not Americans and foreign governments, and those that are held by Americans and within this country. All of those various analyses, I think, are important and helpful and beneficial. So, for example, right now about 48% of the public debt is held by non-Americans or non-American institutions. I don't think that that's the big issue. I think that the big issue is the simple fact of the growth of the servicing of the debt and its implications for the capacity of government to do things because it has money at hand with which to do things. But federal debt is not a brand new thing. This is a graph showing the debt held by the public, federal debt held by the public relative to gross domestic product, which I think is a very valuable measure. If the relationship between gross domestic product and debt is one in which the debt is lower relative to gross domestic product, that suggests that the capacity of the economy as a whole to generate the kind of wealth that can then be taxed so that the federal government can do things is more capacious. When the debt is very large relative to gross domestic product, that means that the entire society's resources that can be made available towards the government doing things is more strained. The high point in that relationship was immediately after World War II, no big surprise. There was tremendous effort made by Harry Truman and by successive administrations after World War II to reduce that relationship. Harry Truman made the largest reduction in the debt in a single year, and there is a continuous downward trend of that relationship between the debt and GDP all the way to the Reagan administration. Around about the time of the Reagan administration, that relationship changes again so that the debt grows in relationship to the GDP all the way to the present moment. Andrew Jackson in 1835 was the president who managed to get the federal debt the lowest. He had a strong ideological commitment to a very low public debt, and he got it down to $33,000, $703.05. But I think it's important for us to realize that the federal debt is not some kind of a new thing. It's not something that we in particular should be blaming on the Bush administration or the Obama administration, each of whom had made their contributions to that by decisions that they made in terms of policy. But it's a reality of American political life. The problem is not that we have federal debt. The problem is how we manage that and how we manage that in relation to the capacities of the economy at large and how we manage that in relation to the proper purposes of government. So, we have a bad situation in practice, but is it really such a bad situation in terms of principle? There's a saying, I'm trained as a philosopher, and philosophers have, this perennial question, that might not work in practice. I mean, that might work for you in practice, but does it work in theory? And so this is the kind of thing that I have to ask myself. So in principle, is this a bad thing? And yes, I think the fact that we have an ever-growing debt that constrains the capacities of the federal government to do the things that government should be able to do is a bad thing. Because government exists for a particular set of reasons. This is a picture of Gustavo Dudamel, who's the current conductor of the LA Philharmonic Orchestra, a magnificent conductor. And the image of a symphony orchestra, for me, it's an image that I learned from my predecessor at the Center for Public Justice, Jim Skillen. It's an image of justice. So justice is that situation in which the wide array of God's creatures can flourish, can give expression to that for which they were created in such a way that they can coexist in harmony. And so that, I think, is also true with regard to our social life, so that we don't have a social cacophony, but we have a harmony that is brought about by the exercise of justice, public justice, by citizens and government in concert. And so the purpose of government is to make sure that there is public justice. I think a Christian vision of government is a vision of active government. And it's a vision of political community between government and citizens seeking together to achieve public justice. Government exists for certain purposes. And so for governments to be able to do what they exist to do, they have to have the necessary resources. And so I think that a situation in which the servicing of debt constrains the capacities of government to do that which governments are called to do is a very serious problem in principle. I think we are faced with a larger cultural context within which this particular problem of the federal debt has to be understood. And I think in last night's conversations between Arthur Brooks and Jim Wallace, the cultural context within which we have to understand our political life was brought to light, I think, in helpful ways. I think it is important for us to recognize, and I think Mr. Brooks said this to us, this is our problem. We have a culture that is deeply committed, among other things, to at least these two great values: the desire for an unfettered degree of personal autonomy, where we can do what we want and we have an incredible array of choices available to us, and a desire to effectively control our circumstances using our scientific and technical and economic prowess. I think a commitment to those two things in an unfettered way, in an idolatrous way, lie at the deep roots of the debt culture of America. We want to be free. We want to do what we want to do, and we want the resources, the power with which to effect our desires. And if we have to use credit to pay for that, then we will. And so I think what we need to address the problem is not simply to tweak the various elements of the functioning of the federal government. We have to do what Abraham Kuyper in the late 19th century called, we have to do an architectonic critique. We have to look at the social architecture of our society, the deep motivations that shape how we decide to live together. And so to understand the federal debt, we have to understand also our own commitment to indebtedness, the debt culture within which we live. And so I think that the central call that this situation brings to us is a call to repent. We're faced with a call to repentance. Now, I'm not going to bring the end of my talk. I won't do an altar call and ask you to bring your credit cards and, we'll cut them up here. And that's not the kind of speaker I am. You can go to lectures on personal finance where you will have that altar call, but that's not me. I think another matter of principle. So we have a problem in principle because the federal government has to do certain things. It has to effect public justice. It cannot do that without the necessary resources. We have a problem in principle because we are at root committed to not facing up to the constraints within which we as human beings must live in this created order, and so we have a debt culture. And we are faced in principle with a question of intergenerational injustice. As a political community, we have decided that we are going to service certain needs specifically for those among us who are older. We've decided that we're going to construct a social security system that is unsustainable under current circumstances because of valid concerns for the well-being of our older neighbors. Our desire to do this is a good thing. The systematic solution that we've generated to address this desire is unsustainable. We've decided that we're going to provide in certain healthcare needs also, again, for our older neighbors. And we have done so, again, because of a valid desire to take care of the medical needs and healthcare needs of our more vulnerable neighbors, a good thing to want to do. But we have generated a system to do that is unsustainable. What this creates is a situation of intergenerational injustice. Because we are paying for certain things at the moment, we are incurring certain costs at the moment, but we're asking succeeding generations to bear that cost. And that is not just. And I think that intergenerational justice is an element of public justice that in principle demands of us that we address the problem of the federal debt. Okay, what then should be done? A moment ago I said we need an architectonic critique. I think that the problem with which we're faced is one that at root demands repentance, and I think it's a problem that requires responses by every possible element in our human society. It requires certain choices from families and from churches, from all kinds of institutions. I want to talk about just two institutions, and one of them in two parts: the state and the market. These were the two institutions that were raised yesterday in the conversation as two alternative options for how we might forge a future. Mr. Brooks suggested that it's going to be either a growing state or a freer market that will be our salvation. He chose the freer market as the messianic agency. I disagree with that. I don't think that that's where our salvation lies, but I do think that we have to find ways to behave responsibly within these institutions to address the problems that we have. So, our political community and the business community, how do we respond in these two various capacities to the problem with which we're faced? I want to suggest three things to you that I think the federal government has to do. I think in the first place it's necessary, basically necessary, to reform entitlements. We have to find ways to make our concerns for older Americans work better. And this is what we are not currently able to do. There are not incentives for those who currently govern to really address this problem, but the problem will simply be something that we must address in the very near future. So we have to find ways of reforming entitlements. There are an array of ways in which this could be done, some of which would be very painful and some of which would be less painful, all of which are apparently politically unpalatable at the moment in the political situation that we have. Talking to economists on the left, some of the suggestions that I've heard that strike me as plausible is raising the retirement age by a few years, which with increasing healthy older ages seems to me to be a good way. And I've looked at people parsing the numbers in terms of the effect of that. It looks like a very good suggestion. I've heard people suggest that we should be taxing investment incomes in a similar way to how we are taxing our incomes from work, and there seems to be good possibilities in that. But we have to reform entitlements. We have to govern leaner. This is actually not going to be a huge contribution. People think if we spend a lot less on the military or if we spend a lot less on this or that or the other, it's going to make a massive difference. It's actually not as big a problem as what the entitlements problem would be, but it's certainly something that we can do. And there's, for example, in a military budget, and for what it's worth, I'm a just war guy, and I think that it's a good thing for America to have a very strong military, but I think there's significant room for reducing expenditures on the American military to find ways to govern leaner. And I think that we have to increase revenue. I think there's a number of ways in which it's necessary for us to increase the amount of revenue that the American government raises. That was part of the discussion yesterday, and so I'm sure that Professor Webb will respond to this suggestion one way or the other. However, the American Republic is not just government, it is a community of government and citizens, and so we as citizens also have certain responsibilities. If you want to reduce the American federal debt, cycle. If you look at the expenditures made by the federal government on health care, a very big portion of the increase in those expenditures have to do with the fact that we live longer and that we are ever more obese. The public health costs of increasing obesity in America are incredibly challenging. And so this is actually a public health and a federal debt issue. If you want to make a contribution to the federal debt declining, you can help reducing the expenditures of the federal government on healthcare simply by living more healthily. This is a simple personal responsibility contribution that we can make that actually has a public benefit impact. I think something that we as citizens can do is to strengthen what people in my political tradition would call sphere sovereignty. This is the notion that society consists of a diversity of spheres, each of which has their own proper space that should have certain room within which to function. And so government and citizens together make up a political community that constitutes a certain sphere. Employers and employees make up a business community and a market that constitutes the economic sphere of life. The idea of sphere sovereignty includes the notion that all of the things that must be done in a society is not properly done politically, but that it's really good to address many of our problems in other ways than by means of political means. And so while I'm not a libertarian, I really think that one of our problems in the American Republic is that we want our governments to solve too many of our problems that are indeed problems and that must be solved, but that are not appropriately solved by governmental action. And so I think it is really necessary to make sure that there's proper room for the functioning of the economic sphere, markets to function well. It's really important for many of the needs of our neighbors to be met by non-governmental, non-profit, civil society institutions which require a certain room within which to function. We as citizens, by our actions, by starting new organizations, by addressing problems in ways that are non-political ways, expand sphere sovereignty in ways that I think help address the problem, because if certain solutions do not require government intervention, it also means that it does not incur costs to government. I think it's important for us as citizens to defend institutional religious freedoms, because many of the problems which a welfare state seeks to address are in fact better addressed by religious institutions, specifically with regard to the alleviation of poverty. And so it's a really great thing when a variety of non-governmental agencies are able to address certain problems. It has the beneficial side effect that those are then not costs, again, to governments. Here in your state, there are difficulties, for example, with regard to the shift of responsibility with regard to adoptions to government-related agencies, because the religious freedoms of certain charities are constrained because of decisions made by governments. And so I think it's necessary for us as citizens to defend institutional religious freedom so that these various agencies can do what they do. And finally, what is to be done by businesses? Mr. Brooks last night suggested that one of the great problems that we have with regard to income inequality is that we have a failing public education system. I really deeply believe that that is true, but I think that there is going to be little done by that if a variety of institutions in society don't demand that that should change. And I think that businesses, as agents within the economic life of this country, can make a difference by insisting that we reform the public education system. I think that we need the wealth to tax to be able to allow government to do what it needs to do. And because of that, I'm someone who believes very strongly that it's necessary for us in our little garages in places like Palo Alto to start up new companies and from scratch build up organizations like Apple, which is now the most valuable corporation in the world, which are the engines that generate the wealth, which we can then tax so that we're able to do the things that governments must do. And I think it's very necessary for us when we are business leaders to rehumanize our workplaces, because if we want the capacity in America to generate the kind of wealth that is necessary to be able to do the public projects that we want to do, it is necessary for working people in this country to have the context in which they can meaningfully contribute to the generation of such wealth. I don't think that these are all the things that we need to do, but I think that we are faced with a situation where if we do not take responsibility, when we as citizens do not take responsibility for the federal debt, we will be faced with a situation in which there are increasing tensions, certainly among the young and the old. I don't think that we are going to have a war between the young and the old on the scale portrayed in Albert Brooks's 2030. I don't think that we will face the kind of conflict between the young and the old that is on the same scale as the zombie apocalypse. But I think that we are called to shalom. And I think we are called to the kind of society, creating the kind of society here amongst us that points forward to God's new world to come, in which there will be peace between young and old also, as the prophet Zechariah could foresee by the gift of God. And so I think that this challenge which faces us is not some kind of force of fate that is beyond the scope of our responsibility to address. But I think that it is high time for American citizens to take responsibility and to demand of those who lead us that this particular problem be addressed in such a way that we can live in justice and that we can live towards peace with one another. Thank you.
I am, by the way, one of your older neighbors that was mentioned in Gideon's talk, one who's having just gone through the problem of going through the bureaucracy of the welfare state to try to figure out how to get Medicare and Social Security. And believe me, that's not fun. I agree with about 95%, maybe even higher, of what Gideon said today. So I don't have a lot here to criticize, but I do have some things to maybe focus on a little bit that didn't get focused upon in his talk. I agree, first of all, that the problem is really one of entitlements. It's Medicare, it's Medicaid, it's Social Security, which are promises made to people, but without funding those promises in a responsible sort of way. I tell my students, I often say, thank you, students, by the way, that you're going to fund my retirement, and I'm going to enjoy that, and good luck getting it yourself. But you know, it's even worse, I think, than in some ways than Gideon presented it. In some of my classes, I talk about, you know, our so-called Social Security Trust Fund, which sounds good. You know, all right, we're putting away funds for payment in the future to retirees, but in point of fact, that's not true. There is no real asset at all in the Social Security Trust Fund. Nothing but IOUs from the U.S. Treasury. And so at the point at which we tap the trust fund, the federal government, the Treasury Department, is going to have to do one of two things: raise taxes, cut expenditures in some way, or borrow more money. There's nothing there at all. And most people don't realize that or understand it. But that's the truth of the matter. Another issue, I think, in relation to entitlements, and you mentioned President Roosevelt and the kind of initiation of the welfare state. But I think there was a big political compromise that was made at that time and has kind of continued to this point. We didn't just focus on the poorest of our neighbors and those in the most need, but we included in that compact the middle class. And I think that was a political way of getting a widespread approval for those programs. So it isn't like we're just taxing ourselves to give money to the poor. We're also going to get the benefit. And I think that's been a major problem, that we continue to give Social Security payments to Donald Trump or Medicare or whatever, and never mind the middle class. How about the rich? I mean, that's a place to start right there in reforming entitlements, in my view. I also think that we have, and I don't have to tell you about political issues, but a real political problem here in that politicians really don't have much of an incentive to engage the debt issue as they should, because politicians want to get reelected. They get reelected not by inflicting pain on people, but by giving them goodies that they want, benefits that they want, programs that they want, and lower taxes as well, which they want. And of course, those are incompatible. And so in order to be reelected, you don't say, remember back to my youth, when 1964, when Barry Goldwater was running for president, that none of you remember that, but, well, David does, okay, I see, okay, David Lowenstein, okay, and who went to campaigning in Florida and campaigned against Social Security in Florida. Now, I'm not saying that's the only reason that he lost. There are lots of other reasons, but that certainly didn't help him any. And so what politician has got the courage to stand up and say, we need to rein in entitlement spending, whether it's raising the retirement age a notch or two, whether it's taxing the benefits of the wealthy more significantly, or simply making it a transfer program instead of entitlement for all. I don't think we've got the political courage to really tackle that. And so I am very pessimistic that, especially in this era of two rival parties that are miles apart coming to any sort of agreement on this, and I'm not optimistic about that happening in the future as well. Just one other point that I'd like to make with regard to the budget problems and debt. I think we're making a big mistake in looking for massive short-run cuts in the budget spending. I'm all for looking for things that we could cut. We could cut all kinds of agricultural subsidies. We could cut corporate welfare. There's lots of things that we could cut, and I think it would harm no one at all. But every dollar less that we spend by the government is a dollar less that's going to someone's salary, at least for the most part. And when we're in the midst of a prolonged period of economic downturn, It strikes me as we need to focus on more medium to long-term solutions to this problem and not try to solve it all at once. And I think the markets would respond, financial markets that we always hear are responding to everything, would respond favorably to a plan that was put in place that would, over the next 10 to 15 years, let's say, bring our budget into balance and then follow through on it. One comment that I have to make on one thing I did disagree, which is taxing investment. I think that's the last thing we want to do is impose further taxes on investment. We want investment, and I would even suggest that we cut the capital gains tax as opposed to increasing it to equal the personal income tax rate. Those are some comments. Thank you.
Okay, we have time for general Q&A, but first, a very important announcement. If the zombie apocalypse does break out, don't panic, but there are two exits. But why don't we start, if there's anything in Professor Webb's comments that you'd like to respond to, Gideon, if you'd like to, if not, we can just throw it out to the audience, and mics going around, and if you would just introduce yourself and a question, preferably a long sermon, but again, if you want to begin by offering some remarks.
Maybe just three very brief responses. I'm very much persuadable on the imprudence of taxing investment. I'm not persuaded, but I'm persuadable. I understand the incentives that are involved. So that's something, where I think what I would say is I don't know enough to be sure what I think about that now. I can understand the arguments for both positions at this time. So that's one thing. Secondly, I would strongly agree that it is not possible to come about with some precipitous solution, slash spending in this way and raise revenue in that way. I do think that we need to look at a 10 to 15-year process. But then we've been bringing about the problem of the federal debt starting in 1980. So we've been making decisions over that long period of time that led to the situation that we have now. I think we have less time to fix it before we're faced with a crisis so deep that we have to do very painful things. And so I think making decisions now to begin to do things over the next 10 or 15 years will mean that we have less pain, less quickly, than if we don't do something and then we simply have to be. There will be a situation where the federal government simply will have to do something because it won't be able to govern without some kind of solution. Let's not get there. And then finally, I think that courage is the key issue. We need political courage, but I don't think that we should seek that political courage in the first place among our political leaders. I think we should seek that political courage, first of all, among ourselves as citizens. Now, that means leadership, but I think that it's necessary for us to begin to constitute a constituency for the kind of change that is necessary. And that's a very hard thing to forge, and we don't, at this moment, seem to have people who are able to or willing to have the personal courage to forge that. And so this is a call to repentance, I think.